All right, so last week we talked about how some of the earlier Old Testament history books were big, sweeping, like national histories of Israel and its kings and all the things that the kings were up to, since at that time, that kind of earlier, stronger period in their history, they were feeling confident, they were feeling strong, they were looking towards this big, grand future as it continued. And all of the kings, whether it was a king of the united monarchy of Israel, Saul, David, Solomon, or even when they split, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, all the kings would have thought, God is with us, so nothing bad could ever happen to us, so we can do whatever we want. And when you read the books of Kings, like we've said before, often it will say, so-and-so reigned as king for this many years, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So, sadly, we've talked about over the last few weeks, that led to them doing bad things, the country doing bad things, and then facing the consequences. And the big consequence was being attacked and conquered and captured and exiled in a foreign land. So last week we read from kind of the later Old Testament history books that were put together by a chronicler who wanted to help the people know where they came from as they returned from exile to Israel and tried to restart their community after the worst period they had ever experienced. And then, I kind of hinted at this at the very end last week, after that time, when they restarted the community and their country, after that time, the Jewish writings became a little more personal, a little more specific, and a little more intimate in the stories that they told. And the two books that we're going to look at and talk about tonight, Jonah and Ruth, are really good examples of that trend towards personal stories of a person or their family and what they do, and in a trend away from kind of the big, sweeping, kingly history, because Israel didn't have a king after this. So there was no big monarchy story to tell, and the writings were more focused and personal. So the Book of Jonah, as a brief introduction, the book is set in the 8th century BC, and it was finally written down sometime in the 5th century BC, probably. So again, after the exile, they come back and they want to preserve their stories, their traditions. They want to help teach future generations. These are the stories, our identity that's important to us. Let's write things down. Maybe it had been written down, and then when, like King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed the temple, it said he ransacked it and took all of the artifacts and destroyed them. So maybe it had been written down in the past before the destruction and exile, but now they want to make sure that it's preserved for future generations. And the Book of Ruth is another example of that. It's an old story that is set during the period of the Judges, and it was also probably finally written down in the form that we have it after the exile, when they wanted to preserve their stories. In both books, they help the new restarted Jewish community develop a better understanding of big things, even though they're very focused stories. Like any really good story, even if it's about one person, it can help you get a big, deep understanding. And so Jonah and Ruth really touch on things like nationality, geography, the identity of people, the identity of the Israelites, of other tribes, of other countries, and how their covenant, that important, old, long-standing covenant, how might be related to those things. So that's what we're going to look at tonight, and to help us cover 2 whole books of the Bible in one night, in just 30 minutes, I'm going to divide you up and give one half the room the Book of Jonah, and the other half the room the book of Ruth. And they're both very small books. So I think you can kind of skim them and maybe even read big chunks of them and get the gist. So let's see. Does anybody have any requests? I can go either way. Jonah and Ruth. Let me hear you now. Jonah. Okay. Jonah on this side. Okay. So let's see. I'm going to say the table in the middle. You're going to be on the Jonah side, and this over here is going to be on the Ruth side. So everybody's got the same 4 questions, and there's a little introduction statement as well to help get you started thinking. So go ahead and pull out and turn to the book of Jonah on this side and the book of Ruth on this side. And while you're turning, I will give you some questions to think about. Yeah. Good. And if anybody is watching from home, I'm going to pause the video now so that you have time to read and look at the books of Jonah and Ruth before we keep talking about them.
Play games. You know.
It almost struck me the way you read this. Jonah went in there and he began to sort of preach. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It had to be harder than that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it reads like, well, they listened and they believed it.
Yeah, they will follow along.
He probably, Jonah probably thought, it was that easy.
All right. Let's hear what you all came up with and learned from these stories. And we'll, like I said, each group had the same questions. So we'll take each question one by one and we'll go back and forth, and feel free to share or compare answers for the other group, because these are, pretty familiar, somewhat familiar stories to folks who've kind of been in church a while, or at least kind of read the Bible. You kind of have a working knowledge of these stories at least. But let's do the first question. We'll start on this side with Ruth. Was there anything that you hadn't noticed before that kind of stood out to you or jumped out to you as you read the story of Ruth today? Maybe not, but, want to ask.
Well, I had kind of forgotten about the conversation at the gate about the kinsman redeemer and the very subtle work that happened to get Ruth available to Boaz, and the land available to Boaz. So that was interesting to me to not have had that at top of mind and to be reminded how that came down. But I also thought that helped show kind of what the rules were, what the traditions were in that story, and that would have been helpful for the people after the exile to know.
Yeah, those first kind of few chapters were really set up. This is how things were done, and for both good and bad. And if you need this, you got to work the system this way. And if you need this, then you need to rely on that. Yeah. Anything else that stood out about Ruth? That does. Okay. What about Jonah? Anything that you kind of had forgotten about or hadn't noticed before that stood out to you? What was it?
I had forgotten that God sent the plant to give him shade.
And then?
And then the worm ate it up the next morning.
Yeah. And it's that last chapter of Jonah where that happens that doesn't always get read or told, especially, this is a great story for kids, because, oh my gosh, this guy gets swallowed by a fish. That's a great, what kid doesn't know that story? But whether it's in, vacation Bible school or Sunday school, that last chapter isn't really included when the kids are told, like, the fun, neat Jonah story. It usually ends with all the people of Nineveh repented, and isn't that great? But then, at the end, Jonah is hot, so God grows a plant, and then a worm eats the plant.
And I attribute that to the fact that I was never told that, not that I had forgotten. They just got to the fish.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's kind of when the story is retold, or told to someone for the first time, that's kind of the centerpiece. And then that concluding chapter isn't always included when someone, in church reads the story.
Now, I had forgotten about the fact that Jonah, when Nineveh repented and God blessed him, that made Jonah angry.
Big time.
And instead of being grateful and thankful for it, he was mad because he tried to say, God, I told you that.
Yeah,
I tried to tell you that beforehand and you didn't listen.
yeah. He said.
Which is a kind of a common human reaction, I think.
To almost be upset with how understanding and forgiving God is of other people that either we don't like, or that we don't want to forgive, or we don't understand. Yeah, and Jonah said, I think I heard Marcia said this earlier, Jonah was telling God, I knew this would happen, I knew you would do this, that's why I didn't want to go there, Anything else that jumped out, in the book of Jonah?
For years, I just always assumed when God told him to go, and I thought, well, he went left and you should have gone right, but then you look, it says he was headed for Tarshish. That was the end of the known world. It's near Gibraltar, modern day Gibraltar now, and so there wouldn't have been anything beyond that other than the Atlantic Ocean. So he literally was trying to go off the map.
Yeah, as far away as he could possibly go. All right, what about the second question, for the book of Ruth? What makes this a good story? What's interesting about it?
Well, the fact that it ties things in so neatly. Most of the scriptures are written from a family lineage bloodline. And the bloodline of David was only interrupted 3 times. Abraham's wife, one of his wives, was a foreigner, and of course Ruth was a foreigner, and then later Bathsheba. But it's a fine point that even though these were not bloodline Abraham descendants, this was the mother of Jesse, the grandmother of Jesse. She played a very important role in history.
Yeah. So the story has importance. It's not just, isn't that a neat story? But, this is actually an important, you kind of read through and you go, this is an important story,
And another thing on this particular story, it's a preview of what's to come, really, because when Joseph died and left Mary as a widow, his brothers were supposed to take care of Mary. But because of the unusual birth of Christ, according to history, they did not want to do it. So that's why Christ still lived at home when he was 30 years old, still taking care of his mother. And when he was on the cross, he passed that responsibility to John, take care of my mother.
That's right. Woman, this is your son.
Yes, but looking back, the brothers of Joseph were supposed to do that, according to the history, according to their rule.
Kinsman redeemer and all that. Yeah. What else, from the book of Ruth, you think makes this just a good story in itself? What's interesting about this story?
Well, I like it because it's 2 women, and it's, the daughter-in-law she becomes a daughter and, sets aside her heritage, to become part of, Naomi's people. And, is kind of unquestioning about the advice that Naomi gives her. I think that is a beautiful part of the story.
Yeah, it's about just a great relationship and commitment. And you can almost, like, when you envision the scene at the beginning when Naomi tells Ruth, like, no, just go away, do your own thing, you'll find your own success. And Ruth says, no, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, your God will be my God. You can see that in the movie, just like, it's just like the dedication and commitment and, that'd just be a really heartwarming, and the devotion throughout, What about the book of Jonah? What makes the book of Jonah just a good story in itself? What's interesting about it? That's kind of an obvious one.
It's very much an action movie.
Yeah, I mean, guy gets swallowed by a big fish, that's action packed. And the storm, thunderstorm, they're throwing stuff overboard, what's gonna happen? And he's in the belly of the whale, and then he gets to Nineveh, and and the king makes even the animals fast and wear sackcloth, and, it's just, there's a lot of stuff going on, yeah.
If you step back from it, it's about a man who liked to keep God at a distance, at a comfortable distance.
Mhm.
And that doesn't work out well.
Yeah, and he thought he could achieve that physically if he just, went in a certain direction. But when he was at the bottom, not just of the barrel, but almost the sea itself, then he realized that God was even there, with him there. Yeah. All right, well, what about the third question? What lessons in this story would have been good for its original readers to hear? After the exile, they come back, they're trying to reestablish their community and religion. What would this story have for them and have to help them? And remember, if other groups want to chime in, because you might be familiar with the other group story, feel free to go ahead. But what about Ruth? What lessons might it speak to its original readers when they were restarting their community?
Well, probably the way things worked, as they were saying earlier, how
Mm-hmm.
when Boaz talked with the kinsman, redeemer, and kind of made him aware of what could happen if he took Ruth and her land. And to know that those were kind of, I don't know if it was written rules, but that was their culture and their unwritten rules, but it was an understanding by everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be helpful if that was gonna be the way things were, for people to know that.
Yeah, absolutely. For this whole generation that had grown up not in Israel, in this foreign land that was not amenable to them or their religion, this would be a really helpful story to say, this was the way our people organized their society and their family relationships, and this is how things were done. And it would help them go, oh, okay, like when this happens, we can do this, and this is the old ways, this is the tradition that they might not have known about or learned about in growing up in exile. Yeah. And Ray had already said something that I think is useful and a good answer for this question, because the people who have come back from exile and they don't know, are we still a part of the covenant? Are we still in the line of God's blessing? Is there nothing here and we got to start from scratch? The Ruth story, kind of shows that God is kind of overarching, even from David, even to now, and then maybe into the future, so they can go, oh, okay, maybe there is a larger thing that we can still be a part of, and we haven't just been kicked out of that larger God work altogether. Mm-hmm. Other stuff that Ruth's original readers might have gone, oh, about, right? Whether either surprising or helpful or encouraging.
The other point about tradition, it might have refreshed their memory about what was stated, that you weren't supposed to go back over your field after you had harvested from it for the purpose of the poor, which is in this story.
Yeah.
I mean, it just was common for people to follow behind the harvesters to glean what was left over.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't know what kind of a farming or harvesting they might have been able to do when they were in exile in Babylon. And so coming back and reading this story and go, oh, that's how God's kind-hearted, compassionate people should act. That they work their fields, and if stuff is left over or kind of falls out, or there's stuff on the margins, don't be greedy, don't suck up all you can. Leave those for folks who really need it. That's the way God's kind-hearted people should act. Yeah, and they'd say, okay, well, that's good to know. What about the story of Jonah? What lessons might Jonah's original readers have heard and would have helped them or surprised them or get their community and faith restarted? Or that they might have needed to hear at that moment?
Repentance always brings connection back to God again,
Yeah.
And in the very last verse, he's fussing at Jonah about, you're concerned about this, should I not be concerned about this town of all these people? So that he indicates he does not abandon his people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they may have felt abandoned during the exile, and they're being reminded here that God doesn't do that.
Yeah. There's always hope because God is always there, so you can always repent. God always cares about you. And that is really communicated in the book of Jonah, because who are the people that are used to show that lesson in Jonah? Like the nice neighbor down the street that went to church every Sunday or something? No, it was the enemy, like one of the biggest enemies ever of the entire Israelite people, because the Assyrians, capital in Nineveh, king would have been Nineveh, they conquered and destroyed and annihilated the northern kingdom of Israel, half of the Israelites, or whatever the population breakdown, the whole northern kingdom. We don't have records that they went into exile and then returned. They just kind of were in the wind and were just dispersed. So that's the crazy message of Jonah. Not just that God forgives those who are counted amongst God's people, should they make mistakes or slip up, but even the people you hate the most, who've done the worst things to you, which is what Jonah would have been thinking. It's not even too late for those people when it comes to God's forgiveness and God's love. Wow, that'd be pretty incredible, especially since we think about the returning exiles would have had some unruly neighbors who were not glad that these new Israelites have come back and said, now we're here, we're going to do this, we're going to rebuild this. And in the books of like Ezra and Nehemiah, they're trying to rebuild the walls of the city, rebuild the temple. The neighbors are giving them a hard time. And this message of Jonah would have been a really convicting reminder that those folks you don't like most in the world, God will even show grace to those folks should they repent and turn to God. Wow. And when the book of Jonah ends, refresh my memory, but it doesn't say that Jonah himself necessarily kind of got that idea. He's still kind of grumpy at the end, right? It just kind of leaves it open, and maybe that was the point. And the story is still open. You want to still be grumpy, still hold a grudge, or do you want to recognize that God will forgive anybody, even those people who have wronged you? Well, what about, like, as we're thinking about this, we'll go ahead and end here. What are some similarities or similar common themes in both these books that kind of larger themes in both Ruth and Jonah that you can pick up on as you've heard both groups kind of talk? Is there any similarities?
You can't run from God.
You can't run from God, no matter where you might be. Mm-hmm.
Well, and they both seem to expand God's reach beyond the people of Israel.
Yeah. Expand God's reach both physically, in terms of whatever city you might be in, or even country you might be in, whether you have to leave for a famine or whatever you have to. God's reach is both physical, but also God's reach is, what would the word be? But God's reach ignores political boundaries and national, geographies of people groups and ethnic identities. Which would have been a really revolutionary thing at the time. And even when Jesus was preaching his message, and even after Jesus, when Paul was working hard just to bring the Christian message to Jews who happened to be not quite as Jewish, or Gentiles who weren't Jewish at all. Like the idea of God's expanding reach was a really big new concept for the people of Israel to kind of accept. And these stories do a great job of like planting the seed. And that's kind of the beauty of a good story. Like it doesn't hit you on the head and say, you gotta think this and you gotta stop thinking that and you gotta do this instead because you've been totally wrong. What's the matter with you? You know, if you say that to somebody, are they gonna listen to you? Are they gonna say, you know, you're right. You make a good point with your fist. Maybe I've been wrong this whole time. No, but this story, especially at this time, in like the year 500 something BC, 400 something BC, that idea that God's welcome and reach could extend beyond just the Jewish people would have really kind of blown their minds. In the Jonah story, it blew Jonah's mind. In the Ruth story, it was kind of hard. There needed to be some kind of jumping through hoops to kind of get Ruth in there, included in the covenant. But yeah, both these stories show that God is not exclusive, but is inclusive to anyone who would seek to follow the way of the Lord. Anyone who would want to repent, give their lives to God, and seek God's righteousness. And that it's kind of a subtle message that they might not have picked up on at first, but it really kind of set the stage for what would come and what Jesus, what he would definitively open up the invitation, and then Paul would do the work of taking that invitation, and then the church had to have a lot of business meetings and committee meetings to argue whether, you know, that invitation is valid or is there any other requirements and yada, yada, yada through Acts. Because they still had to process it a while. Even Christians had to process it. No, can they really? They might have to be Jews. No. So that thinking process took a few 500 years, and these stories kind of get them started thinking about it. And also that kind of bigger picture is that God is at work, and nothing can stop God's overall ultimate work that supersedes our understanding of time, what's bad today, it's the end of the world today, because that's all we see is today. But both these stories say God's work is bigger than you think it is, in places you might not expect, amongst people you might not expect. And you can be included in that, and so can they. And you might have a hard time accepting that, Jonah. But that's how big God's work is. So we'll end there. Take that as your reminder this week that God's work is even bigger than we might have thought already. And we can be included in that, and so can anyone who repents and turns to the Lord. So let us not resist like Jonah did, but recognize that God's doing new things and invites us to be a part. So go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and we'll keep reading through the Old Testament next week.